Postcards from a Dying World, the podcast. For more than a decade, I've reviewed over 1,000 books that are mostly science fiction, horror, and bizarro. This feed will feature bonus audio I have produced over the years, as well as a monthly digest of reviews based on what I've read each month, plus the occasional bonus material about my own fiction. Thanks for listening. Hello and welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. This is your host, David Agranoff, back again with another interview based on one of the best books I've read in a long time. I'm very excited to have our author here, but really quickly, before I introduce Hailey, I just want to remind everybody, I try not to do all the like, hey, subscribe, rate, review, all that stuff. I don't like to do a ton of that stuff, but I am realizing I do need to do a little bit of that just because I need to remind people to do that because I know that's part of the thing. So if you can help support the podcast, the most important thing for me is sharing these interviews. If you like the work of the author that I'm interviewing or the person I'm interviewing, because I am trying to break out from just doing author interviews, please share. And of course, I don't have a Patreon, but if you want to support my books, they're always in the show notes. That's my favorite way that you can support my efforts. But anyways, we have a very special guest here today. Hailey Piper got on my radar with when the cover reveal went around for this book, The Worm and His Kings, and I was immediately interested. And then I followed Hailey on Twitter, and she has all kinds of amazing like content there, just because she's just a person I enjoy following. But anyways, Hailey, welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. Can you tell the folks, how you got into horror and what we're doing here today?
Sure. I got into horror when I was little, seeing movies I wasn't supposed to yet, and just kind of stuck with it ever since. Today, I guess we're talking about The Worm and His Kings from Off Limits Press.
Well, we
Um,
can talk about all the other
oh,
stuff too,
sure.
like the stuff leading up to it. I want to get there, and we're eventually going to do spoilers, folks. But we're going to try to stay non-spoiler free at first, and then hopefully create a spot where people can pause, read the book, and come back if they haven't read it yet. But I know a lot of people have read it because there's a lot of good praise out there. So you grew up in New York. What part of New York did you grow up? I saw in your bio it said by the Haunted Woods, and now that has me curious too, because that must have played a role as well.
Yeah, oh, definitely. I grew up in like the Catskills area. Um, Yeah, there was woods behind my house and it was scary at night. You'd hear all kinds of things, and when you're little, you don't know what all that is. I used to think Bigfoot was back there, but then I learned that he was only in California, but I didn't
Well,
give up.
yeah, right. Well, I spent a fair amount of time in upstate New York. Lived in Syracuse for several years, which is a lot further west. But I think New York State beyond the city is underrated for its spooky woods.
Oh,
It,
absolutely.
yeah, and I definitely, especially up around there, Adirondacks too. There's just some really beautiful nature. But did you have any particular? Now you said horror movies when you were young, but did you have a kind of horror fiction origin? Was there somebody who you discovered first, or spoke to you first as a writer?
I mean, I started reading Dean Koontz books like when I was 9 or 10, I think. I snuck into my mom's room because just the covers were interesting to me. They looked very serious and adult, and I was very much like, I want to be a serious adult, so I will read this. And then finding like Mr. Murder and Intensity, and I think my favorite was Watchers. Um,
Intensity is my favorite because I'm not a big Dean Koontz fan, but I think Intensity is incredible.
yeah, I haven't read them since I was preteen, but yeah, they were fun back then.
Right, right. Well, yeah, I do think Intensity is the one that I read as an adult and was like, wow, like this is actually really good because some of that Coon stuff didn't age super well. But
He wrote so many books, and he's still writing
exactly,
so many books.
Yeah, yeah, you can't write that many and have them all be perfect, right? Um, but okay, so that's how you got into reading. Now, did you always want to be a writer from an early age?
Um, I mean, partly I wanted to tell stories. I know at one point I wanted to like be a movie director, but it kind of just fell away as I read more and more books. I graduated I was reading R.L. Stein and Stephen King, um,
Hmm.
and just absorbing so much. So it was pretty early though, and I think once I read it, Stephen King's It, that was when I knew definitely, like I was like I think 15 or 16, that I definitely wanted to be a writer.
Hmm. And what about that book? Was it seeing the construction or being able to pick apart like how it was pulled together? Was that what it was,
I
or?
mean, I don't think I was sophisticated enough yet to dissect that stuff. I just knew it had intense like emotional weight upon me, all the layers of the adult stuff and the childhood stuff like going back and forth, and just the um breadth of imagination. Like I think a lot of people don't give that book enough credit for the scope it has, especially by the finale. Like that was definitely my first brush with cosmic horror.
Yeah, yeah, no. Well, and for me, that I was just old enough and had just like discovered King when because he put out 4 books that year, and so it was like the one that when I showed my father how thick it was, he didn't believe me that I was planning on reading it, right? And but he bought it for me, and it was funny because I had the experience of trying to explain it to my dad like very early on, and I think I was in 8th grade, so it was kind of a funny experience. But for me, one of the stories that did it was there was a Stephen King story called The Raft from Skeleton Crew, and Stephen Graham Jones and I talked about that story a lot because it was fundamental for him too. But for me, that was the first time where I figured out like, oh, I see what he's doing here. I see how he's putting the rungs on the ladder, right? And so I do think that those literary influences are from a young age can play such a huge role. That's kind of one of the reasons why I feel like I always want to ask writers that stuff, even though it can be kind of a cheesy question. But
It's
that means,
important.
yeah, yeah, and that leads me to because the writing and I admit I've only read Worm and His King so far of your work, but the writing in this is so assured, it's so confident, at least to me, to my eyes, it is, and so one of my questions was, are you a classically trained writer or self-taught? Because I can't really tell from reading it if you're a MFA graduate or self-taught, but
Oh,
I'm
no,
interested.
no, I never went to MFA or anything like that. I undergrad in English literature, so just a lot of reading, not much writing stuff, but I think I've just been writing manuscripts since I was 16, and like they were not good back then,
Mhm.
obviously. But like, that's how you learn, is just you just keep doing it and doing it and doing it, and challenging yourself.
Mhm. Well, and that just makes it all the more impressive too, because look, I'm a self-taught writer too, so I don't have anything against people doing the MFA programs, but I
No, not at
do.
all.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I do understand, but I get impressed when I see somebody because I know, it's that thing of where Stephen King has said in the past, you can't really be a writer without being a reader, and I think you can,
Absolutely.
yeah, you can tell the people who are serious readers, and so now we talked about some of those influences when you were younger, but what are some of your influences now? Because I'm sure they're very different.
Oh, definitely. I mean, you mentioned Stephen Graham Jones, and he is just incredible, honestly. Sarah Tantlinger, just her poetry is just, I just absorb that. Like I need more of it constantly because it's so gorgeous, and but with describing the kinds of feelings and aspects of horror that make it what it is. Ramsey Campbell. Um, there's a few, like, it's hard to say off the top of my head sometimes, because it's just that I read so many books. I try to, at least. And there's so many talented people right now.
It's funny because, and I did it too, but I think the comparisons to Clive Barker are you get a lot of those comparisons, and I don't know if you didn't mention Clive Barker in that list, but and I see the Ramsey Campbell thing. I really see that now that you mention it. But
Um,
how's that been for you, that you keep getting these comparisons to Clive Barker?
I'm definitely flattered. The funny I have an interesting background with Clive Barker, because my first brush with him was not uh his fiction. It was his fiction, but not like written. It was the Hellraiser that I saw probably when I was 12, I think. And
Very young.
but that really had a huge influence on me, as far as, like, being because my mind was blown. I
Mhm,
was seriously just like, that really changed how I saw a lot of things, and I didn't really fully finish digesting that for years. So, like, it's not like with Stephen King's It was like I read it and immediately it had this impact. With Hellraiser, it was like I don't think I could absorb it yet. I had to watch it many times over, like, the next few years to really digest it and kind of like see how much it had changed how I saw things.
mhm.
Um, so I've only read, unfortunately, I've only read a few of his short stories. I'm really behind on my Clive Barker, but it is a big deal to me when I see the comparisons there.
Well, the short stories are where I see the comparison. Is there's a very specific voice that Clive was developing during the early years with the short stories, and I think the vibe that you've got in this novella really kind of meshes with that in an interesting way. I'm not even sure I know how to describe it. It's just I felt it, and because I was feeling that before I read any other reviews or saw what anyone
Oh,
else
that's
was saying.
funny, because there's so many that say that kind of thing.
Yeah, I know, and I think some of his more cosmic stuff, like a Magica, and some of the later stuff, I could see. Well, partially just because of the realms in a Magica. But anyways, I'm sorry. I could tangent on Clive Barker all day. But I just think it's a really big compliment too, because I think
Oh,
people,
totally.
because one of the other things, one of the things that's interesting about those early years, and why I think the comparisons to Worm and his Kings, it's such a kind of prevalent thing, I think, is because people are missing that vibe, right? Clive hasn't. I know we're going to get some more stuff here soon because he's kind of back writing again, but I think people just are looking for something that has that kind of otherworldly feel, but also very character driven, right? And so I think that's a lot of it. But anyways, so your first release, as far as I could tell, was The Possession of Natalie Glasgow, which, like I said, I've only read this novella, so it might be a good time to tell me and the listeners about this book. Or if you want to start, like, what was the progression like? You said you've been doing manuscripts since you were 16. Are any of those ones that you feel like someday you could recycle, or someday you could turn into something else?
I mean, there's one that I've been kind of like has gone through so many different transformations, and right now it's kind of like it's being looked at by people.
Hmm.
But it's so different. Like, it's practically a completely different organism from what it was, like, almost 20 years ago. But I know that that's where the seeds of it began, where me
Hmm.
writing whatever nonsense I was writing when I was 16. There's one that's coming out next year, from Off Limits Press, A Light Most Hateful. That started when I was, how old was I in 2008? Like 22, I think when I started it.
Hmm.
And it's very different than what it was back then, but it has kind of like just gone through these different metamorphoses until it is what it has become now, and that it'll be finally getting a release. So there are a couple that have, gone through things. A couple others need to probably stay right in the past where they were.
Right, right. Well, you know, Jeremy Robert Johnson, who wrote The Loop, he and I have for years joked about how it would be amazing to put out an anthology of all the cheesy stories that established writers wrote when they
Oh
were
God.
kids, unedited, just
Oh
exactly
God.
like.
Oh no, I would die of embarrassment if I were to do something like that.
Well, I think that's kind of I think that's part of the idea. I know one year at BizarroCon, he read from a story he wrote when he was like 11 years old, and it was absolutely hilarious. Um, and I definitely have a couple of those myself. But so, the Possession of Natalie Glasgow, was that your first like seriously published work, or?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, it's independently done. Um, at the same day was my first short story publication in from Things in the Well Press, I think was the name. Um, so it was kind of just this joint thing. It just happened coincidentally happened that way. And it's just been, God, where am I now? 60 plus short stories later.
Wow,
Um,
that's a lot. That's really good, very productive.
yeah, it's gonna be, I don't know where it's gonna be by the end of this year. um, but yeah, so um, Possession like Glasgow, or T-Pong as Laurel Hightowers has dubbed it at this point. Benny Rose, the Cannibal King, and then the Worm and His Kings.
Hmm. Yeah, and so, what can you tell us about these two books, starting with Possession of Natalie Glasgow? Like, how do you pitch this to people?
Well, it's a kind of it starts with as kind of your typical exorcism story. There's a single mom. She's got a pre-adolescent daughter who's acting strange at night. Doctors can't explain what's going on. She calls in. She gets desperate. She calls in a she's not sure what she is, paranormal researcher, spiritual person, a witch, some people call her, but and that's where the story begins. I had tried to write it from like when the first symptoms start with Natalie, but it just wasn't working. I was like, why not just start when paranormal researcher shows up and just get on with it.
Yeah, so, well, that's one of the fun things that about writing a project is when you can organically see like this is where it has to go. I think for me, like the biggest deal for me on writing short stories, like where I had the breakthrough, was when I realized 9 times out of 10, I almost always could cut the first page in half where I was trying to introduce the world. It was always
Yeah.
just jump right in, you
Yep.
know
Exactly.
is better. Um, I am terrible about submitting short stories because I get overwhelmed with looking at markets, and so most I have two short story collections, but what happened was is very few of them got published in other sources because I get very lazy about that. So when I hear you say how many short stories you've got out there, I'm very impressed
Oh.
um, with your ability to find homes for them. Like how you must be really driven on that. Talk to
Oh,
me
I love
about the.
short fiction. I love it so much. So yeah,
Okay,
I want them to get in front of people.
got it. And what is it about the short form that most excites you?
You can do so much with it. I feel like you can really tackle ideas or characters or even that a book might not be able to sustain.
Mhm.
I think there's something so freeing about a short story because you can just go, you can go to the deep end with it without really having to worry about a narrative that can sustain 100, 200 pages. Um, Even just if you're in a mood, which I get into a lot, if there's just something that's on my mind or something, I can try to write a short story around that thing, and I don't have to try to make a whole book out of it.
Mhm.
I can just get it out of my system a little bit, and hopefully weave it into something interesting that people will want to read, and my hope is get something out of.
Do you have maybe 2 or 3 short stories that are your favorites and where we can find them?
Oh God, that's really hard at
I
this
know that is
point.
hard. I'm sorry.
One, I mean, one of my favorites right now, unfortunately, isn't published yet. They haven't actually announced the anthology for it yet. It'll be a witch themed anthology from Cemetery Gates Media later this year, I believe, or possibly early next year. Story is Magic Loves the Hungry. So
Mm.
when that novelette comes out in that anthology, hopefully people will go check it out. There's I tried to put a bunch of my favorites in the short story collection that just came out from the Seventh Terrace, Unfortunate Elements of My Anatomy. So definitely from there, a couple of my favorites are Feast for Small Pieces, which was in Year's Best Hardcore Horror Volume 5 last year, and my new novelette, Recitation of the First Feeding. Um, and Yeah, I mean, it's hard because like even that just that book has 18 and I was trying to choose like what I felt were the best I had written up to that point. Um and so it's just like and since then there's been a bunch of others. So yeah, it's hard to choose favorites.
Now, Brian Evanson and I talked about this in an interview that hasn't gone up yet, but we talked about how he compiles a collection and whether he was trying to think about them in a straight order. Does he want his readers to read them like from page one, or can they bounce around? How do you feel with this, with your collection? That is it out now or is it
Yeah, it
coming out?
came out May 7th.
Oh, okay. Well, now I have homework to do right away. I have to get that. And so, how did you compile this? Did you put a lot of thought into the rhythm of the stories, or does it matter?
Yes. I
Okay.
think it matters. Well, here's the thing, because if somebody's going to bounce around, you have no control over that. So I feel like the best thing to do is to try to find a flow because there are going to be people who just read it from start to finish.
Hmm.
Um, I kind of go with Ellen Datlow's outlook of it to that your most important stuff is your first story, which is because you want to think about how you're getting people going and you want to think about how you want to leave them. So those two are super important. You also want to have and this is just stuff I pick up, but just like
Hmm.
3 really strong stories at the start. Um, and try to keep the longest one towards the end. It doesn't have to be the last story if it doesn't end with the feeling you want the reader to leave on. That just happened to work out that way for this collection. But yeah, I try to keep the length varied also, and also try to think about how the mood flowed because like the second story in the collection, The Law of Conservation of Death, is probably the most depressing story in the collection. So it was kind of important to me to provide some contrast, and I put a humor horror story right after that to try to, let people know it wasn't all going to be gloom and doom the entire way through.
I did the
Um,
same thing, very intentionally in both of my
yeah.
collections.
And then just try to think of what was going to flow together. There was like a story with a dog was important. I kind of put those close to each other. There was just different thematic stuff. I tried to find a flow. It seemed to work out because I've heard people say they had a hard time stop reading when they were supposed to. So hopefully I did good.
And was the title is it the title of a story or?
No, it's that was a funny situation. Originally, it was going to be called named after the first story, Feast for Small Pieces. And I was talking to my wife one day, and I'm not even sure what we were talking about, but the words unfortunate elements of my anatomy spilled out. And she stopped me mid-sentence. She was like, write that down right now. Um, and I did, and it did become a line in one of the stories, and it became the title of the collection.
Yeah, it's a cool title. Well, one of the funny things too is that it's almost right now. I think a lot of times it's the easiest thing to just pick a story and say like, "Hey, I'm just going to use that title," or "This is my favorite." But coming up with something that thematically kind of explains the collection or gives a vibe or whatever is it's so cool when you can come up with something like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I do like when John Langan, the titles of his are usually some weird thing based off of the whichever story title. He kind of mixes it together because like Children of
Mhm.
the Fang isn't like Children of Fang in other stories, it's Children of Fang in other genealogies.
Right.
I like kind of that kind of thing too.
Yeah. That is cool. Um, I think um, sometimes when people come up with those, they yeah, it just separates. It's just kind of comes up with a cool way to describe stories instead of
Yeah.
just having it be that. Are you a pantser or a planner when you're writing? I
I'm
have to ask.
99, I know, I 99.5% of the time a planner.
Okay.
There've been like 2 short stories that I've pantsed. Um, and then yeah, most of the time and I mean, I'm pretty flexible, so if I'm going along my outline and better ideas come up, I will shift gears on things and usually but from that point, I'll then plan out all the changes that I'm intending to do, and that'll happen as I go. I think the other thing I kind of like I tried to pants something and then I ended up after I finished the first chapter, I ended up planning the rest of it. So it only like got pants. It only was for the first chapter.
Yeah. I am a religious outliner, so
Yeah.
I'm with you on that. And the way I always, whenever people say it's like soulless or whatever, I'm always like, well, if you look at a map of a city, it doesn't mean you've experienced the city.
Right.
You got to go there, and you can
Oh, and it's
always change. Go ahead.
right. Yeah. I was gonna say exactly what you're saying. It's wild what you'll realize while you're writing it and how wrong the outline was from the start.
Hmm.
But yeah, you can always change things if you figure it out better. It's not something you have to you're not contracted to stick to the original outline.
Yeah, this screenplay I just finished, it is almost unrecognizable from the original outline, and a lot of that was me having to let go because of my writing partner was much more willing, and his philosophy on it was that he likes to just go as weird as possible early and dial back, right? And then say, okay, that was and some of the ideas for the original thing were just so insane, and I was like, oh, okay, I don't think it's going to work. But then when you dial back, what I learned about it is that the other thing too is you're never married to the outline. You can always go back and change it. You can always go back and re-outline. I've always done that, but for me, like a lot of times, once I get into the 3 act structure, when I get towards like kind of when I'm hitting those milestones in the story, I like to go back and look at the outline and make changes then, because I've learned about the characters and those kinds of things. But anyway, so all right, let's get into non-spoilers for The Worm and His Kings. This um wow, this book was so great. But I think at the foundation of it, and I like to say I'm usually right when I guess if somebody's a pantser or a planner, because I can usually tell because I'm a plot and structure person. And when I read this, I felt like I was in very good hands, as far as I felt like it was it was it had good structure. Anyways, but the characters, Monique and Donna, are so fundamental to this story, and the fact that um, I think that they're interesting characters, that they come from a background that we're not usually used to seeing in horror, which is that they're homeless, right?
Yeah.
Um, it kind of created something different too. Can you tell me about how early in the stages of this story did you outline them as characters like early on, or did that part come organically?
Oh, I'm trying to remember. That's not a question I get much. um,
And I
let's
probably should
see.
have left that for spoilers, but I want to give
No, it's okay. I
I
don't
want
think
to give
that's a
people
spoiler.
a clue into these characters, because I think they're so fundamental for what makes the book interesting.
Yeah. It's I'm honestly blanking on Donna a little bit. It feels like she just walked fully formed into my head a little bit.
Mhm.
Because I'm completely blanking on her conception in my imagination. Like she is so fundamental to everything that happens. Um, Monique, I know where Monique came from because originally there was a different situation. I had the lore of the worm first before I had the main story, and then that wasn't working for me. That other character, that other plot was more like what Corin experiences in the book,
Mhm.
and it just wasn't clicking with me, and so I kinda had set it aside for a bit. When I came back to it, I had written a short story where there was a character who was also, homeless, and she doesn't go through anything like what Monique goes through, but, she kind of made me start having other thoughts about how to approach the Wordless Kings. I was thinking about Freedom Tunnel, I was thinking about, just kind of the scope of New York City and how lost people can get inside all that, how people fall through the cracks, and Monique came from there. Monique came from those thoughts and realizations. As far as their backstory and stuff, that stuff was just things that just made sense to me. I think the more you think about characters, the more they reveal about themselves to you, and that becomes stitched into everything else you're doing with them.
So we'll come back to them as characters and developing them as characters when we get to spoilers. But how do you pitch this book? Because the way I described it when because I'm kind of always publicly reading at work and stuff like that, and I have specifically one coworker who always wants me to tell her what I'm reading and what it's about, and this was one that I mostly was just like, you know what? I just think you should read it. If you want to borrow it from me, you can, but I think you should pick it up. And I basically said that it's cosmic horror with a very personal story at the heart, and I described it as about just that people that have fallen between the cracks in New York City. But I think New York City is such a huge part of this book as well.
Yeah.
So how do you pitch it?
I honestly kind of I mean, with Twitter and stuff, with the short amount of space you have, I do say just queer cosmic horror, and that seems to be enough to get people's attention sometimes. As far as the story goes, I'll kind of just say like this this woman's girlfriend has been missing for 3 months. She's going to look for her, and she's been looking for her, and one night it seems like there might have been this monster walking the underground that's taken her, and then in that search she finds bigger things that go as about far back, in time and space, and all the ideas that we know about the world are wrong.
Mhm. Well, look.
It gives enough mystery to kind of get people to oh, I wonder what she does discover, and is she going to find her girlfriend?
Well, one of the most important things that I think people are looking for these days in horror fiction or fiction in general is a book that nobody else could write, right? That it comes from a singular voice, a unique voice, and I think your um, connection to the characters, your feeling of social justice that you bring to it, and clearly the influences and the writing ability is kind of creates this stew of something that where I felt like I was reading something I had never seen before, right? So I like the queer cosmic horror because I think that's a good way to put it. And of course, I was saying like this is a great Pride Month purchase you can make,
Yeah.
but I think that singular feeling like, and I don't need it to be, I don't, I don't, I need books. It doesn't matter where the perspective comes from. If you're talking about Joe Lansdale, for example, a lot of his books are very unique, but he's like an East Texas guy, right? But I like his books because it's unique for him. And so I don't want to I don't want to oversell like all the unique things that you bring to the perspective in the sense of just the quality. is so much of what it, and the singular voice is so great in this book. Anyways, I'm sorry if that came off as awkward, but
No, you're fine.
um but I love the I love the feeling that, like, I was reading a story that nobody else could write. And do you, how much did you feel that when you were conceiving this? Like, did you feel that? Because I look for that feeling when I'm writing, like, this is a book that only I could write, right? Like, this is my book,
I guess, I mean, I don't I'll be honest, I don't really think about that stuff while I'm writing. I'm so focused on the characters and themes and the atmosphere.
Sure.
I'm kind of have to isolate what I'm doing from how it feels in the grand scheme of things, because otherwise I will get paralyzed by having by overthinking things.
Hmm.
I kind of have to write it as if no one else is going to read it first, and then after that try to make sure I am going to be able to communicate it to other people. But yeah, I guess I don't really think about that with, because if somebody else were to write something like it wouldn't bother me, I guess. If that makes sense. Like, and I write stuff, that's similar. Like, I mean, Benny Rose the Cannibal King is like, that wouldn't exist without all those 80s slashers, for just as an example.
Hmm.
So it's like, we're all part of, this bigger scheme of storytelling and such. We build off of each other.
Totally.
I don't know if
Right.
that was a good answer to what you were
Oh no, it's
asking me.
great. The other thing too, well, Joe Lansdale, speaking of him, like, one of his favorite pieces of writing advice is write like everyone you know is dead. You know,
Oh yeah, definitely.
yeah,
I'm there's a my first novel is coming out later this year, and I'm really hoping none of my family reads it.
right. Definitely felt that. Um, but so before we get into spoilers, just if there's anything else that you want to say about The Worm and His Kings outside of, like, the actual writing of it. I think one of the cool things about this, and maybe we could talk about this in a way that isn't like a major spoiler, but I think the the Freedom Tunnel, which is like one of the main settings of the story. I got the idea, and I may be over analyzing this, which I tend to do with fiction. But the Freedom Tunnel, for me, it's this tunnel in New York City that a lot of homeless people have kind of made their home to get away from the elements. And I got the idea that they were calling it the Freedom Tunnel in part because um, it was their way to kind of survive outside of the system. And
Yeah, I as far as I'm aware, that is why it was called that.
so it's a real place. It's a
Yeah,
real thing.
that's okay. That's complicated. Part of the reason that this is set in 1990 is because early on, like maybe first or second page, Monique speculates about, like, they should really, like, leave the tunnel alone, let people keep living in the shantytown there. That isn't what happened. In the mid 90s, I think Amtrak started using it again. So no one lives there now.
Mm,
And it's actually, you're not supposed to go there. Like, you can get in trouble. Like, people go there anyway, and they'll film YouTube videos and stuff, but like, you're not supposed to go there.
hmm. Well, it's funny because that's a running theme that those places that people kind of congregated in pre-internet for different
Yeah.
reasons, like punk rockers used to, those of us who are old enough to remember punk in the 80s, when we didn't have message boards that we could hang out on, we usually would pick, like, just a random location in Chicago. For example, they all hung out at a Dunkin' Donuts that everyone called Punkin' Donuts, right? That's now an apartment building, is on that spot. It's just really sad. And so I actually ended up writing a novel about skinheads and werewolves called Boo Boys of the Wolf Reich, and a lot of it takes place at Punkin' Donuts. And a lot of when I was reading about Freedom Tunnels, it kind of reminded me of these places that people would congregate when before the internet, when this is a spot where people were hanging out, and those kinds of things. Like every city had one. Like
Yeah.
yeah, like my hometown Bloomington, we had a park called People's Park that everyone hung out in, and Chicago had Pumpkin, and I know Indianapolis, they all hung out in a parking lot by a flower shop, which is super weird.
Yeah,
But
there was a strip mall in my town that people would gather at. So
yep,
like yeah, it's everywhere. People find a place.
people find a place. And what was interesting to me about Freedom Tunnel is it felt like one of those places in a little different way, because it's, obviously they're living in this situation, but it's cool to hear that there's a history and there's a place. But so without getting into total spoilers, but the mythology of the worm, because a lot of people when they write cosmic horror, they crib Lovecraft, to do this, but you create your
Yeah.
own mythology. And
Yeah, I mean, I have this idea about kind of like because I love like paleontology stuff, like just the eras of the world that the world has gone through, and I wanted to incorporate that into mythos, and it kind of grew over time with this idea of this cosmic worm that had broken Pangea into all the continents. That it didn't just happen naturally; that it was this other force, and just what that would be as far as the present day was concerned.
mhm. And for reasons that, well, I'll get into that in spoilers, but your book is very connected to my favorite, thematically, to my favorite horror novel of all time, Wet Bones by John Shirley, like in a really interesting way. But and I don't know if you've ever read Wet Bones, but yeah, because I assumed it was a zeitgeist thing, that it was like, but we'll get into that in spoilers for Wet Bones too, because but actually I don't think it'll ruin the book, but that is my all-time favorite horror novel. So when I was reading it, I was like, oh, it's kind of neat. It's got like this, because I assumed it was an unconscious connection. But anyways, so before we get into spoilers, just the last part of this interview is just going to be Hailey and I geeking out about the craft of composing this novelette. But from now, here at this point, if you're still listening, just Off Limits Press, the Worm and His Kings. This is a really great introduction to Haley's work, at least as far as I'm concerned, because it was my introduction and I loved it. I'm going to pick up more of her work, especially the short story collection is definitely on my radar right now. And but you can get this, you should get this, you should read it, pause this in your podcatcher and come back. It won't take you long to read it. I could have read it in one sitting, but I actually I slowed myself down in order to enjoy it a little bit more, which is something that is a pretty big compliment for me, because I'm a fast reader, but I got to the point where I was like, I really want to savor this one. So, all right, so we're in spoilers now, everybody.
Oh boy.
All right. So now, Hailey, you can feel free at this point to say whatever you want about the
Oh good.
conception of this. I like to think of this as the portion for the people who have read it, who are writers, that like, what can we learn from reading this? And I know you're a young writer, you're fairly new, but wow, I think there's a lot that writers can learn from this. I was super impressed with your skill and ability, from almost page one. So what we already talked about Panzer Planner, and so um, now balancing the cosmic and personal.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now that's something that's really important in this book. Is this something that you thought about in the outlining stage and making sure that, because sometimes I think having a rhythm of like, this is going to be a very character centric part, or this is when I'm going to do these reveals about their background. These are things that you can cook into the outline. How much did you think about that before you even started?
Um I didn't really. I kind of my approach with rough drafts is that they are going to be rough even if I've outlined.
Mhm.
So I kind of was just trying to focus on just getting the plot through. Um, focus on when she was going, how far she was going to start with things, that's not the right way. When the story would be beginning, like when are we coming into this with Monique, and then when is she going to first find Donna, and then how is everything going to fall apart later, and then just everything in between those things. I don't. Yeah, it's mainly just a matter of feeling it out and being willing to change things. Like, for example, some of the backstory with going on about like her with Dr. Sam, or with them losing their Donna's apartment and then Monique's apartment, just the cascade of you know unfortunate luck that they unfortunate situations that they were in. More of that was like early on, like a lot more of that was chapter 1, but it felt like too much front loading, so it just got
Mhm.
moved around a little bit. I think it's easier to you can plant those things through the book. And I've noticed, like, sometimes readers will lose the details of the things, but they'll get the main situation of it. They'll get the main sense of it and what's important.
One of my favorite um, pieces of writing advice, the director of Silence of the Lambs said in an interview, a random magazine interview that I read years ago, that I always quote this, is he said, he said, "You can confuse me for 15 minutes, but don't bore me for 15 seconds."
Yeah.
And I think having a little bit of confusion early on is almost better, because eh, I'll follow you along and know that if I'm gonna get more of the character later, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so
I,
now,
th- I think when you establish someone's a person, once you can get that across to the reader, they'll follow along, and then they'll trust you a little bit better with, like, okay, we're going to find out why Monique why Monique is hurting, like what is she talking about with these scars. We'll find out more about Donna as we go along. Like those are things that you can wait once you've established who the person is a little better.
yeah, and I think that that was a great narrative choice to kind of push that back, because I'm already invested
Yeah.
in Monique and Donna, and it becomes more heartbreaking when you hear a lot of Monique's backstory, because I'm already invested in this character. I already care about what's happening to her. So now, was the mythology with the worm that we've already talked about a little bit in non spoilers, but you had that was all kind of cooked ahead of time, or thought out?
Yeah, mostly. I would say most of the big parts of it were I didn't under I had to figure out the cult itself a little better as I was writing, because there was a previous draft of this started very different, where Monique wasn't really interacting with the cult. She was kind of more sneaking around a lot more, and it just wasn't working. Like you said, don't bore me for 15 seconds. It got a little boring, and I was just like, I don't want to do this. Not only does it not leave her people to interact with, but it also didn't give the cultists much character, and I didn't feel like the reader was getting to know them. And I wanted to do something different with them, which is why Lady is how she is, where because I was like, I didn't want the like creepy, stoic cultist kind of situation. I wanted someone who was thrilled to be here, like was more like a like somebody who wanted to convert you,
Yeah.
as opposed to just somebody who wanted to scare you and was like, chanting
Mm,
Latin under her breath or something.
yeah, because she really believed in it,
Oh
and
yeah, and
yeah,
she was excited. So I think that was a big
stoked. Yeah.
part. But you see a different thing with like when Bouchard is leading choir, with Donna is talking about a world without hate. And that's one of the most important elements of the lore and the worm, is that none of the humans involved in the story know what they're talking about for certain. They're all projecting a little bit onto this.
hmm Yeah, no, and it really comes across quite well. Now, the parallel that I know, I said this in my review. But to me, storytelling is all about parallels and reversals. That's always like, I'm always looking for, the ways that the characters parallel each other, the way the characters' journey parallels the theme of the story, and ways that we can turn around and reverse these things. And one of the things that I thought was really cool, and one of the reasons why I believed in my heart that you were a planner, is because all the reveals, parallels, and reversals in this story all work really, really well. They're all really solid. And one of the things, there's a quote in the book, and I've got it right here. It's the wounds of this world will be unmade, so says the king. Scars never go away, Monique said. They will when the worm remakes the world. The worm changes you. Now, this idea that the people who believe in the worm, right, like Lady, they they are welcoming this change because they don't, they're forgotten people that have fallen behind under the cracks.
Right.
They're people who are marginalized, so they want to see the world change. They're ready for it, and that makes an interesting situation, because then we have Donna kind of succumbing to this for a reason, because we've been in part rejected by this world and want to see it change. And I think that is one of the things where the parallels and reversals match the theme so well in this story. So anyways, the first thing I want to say is just compliment you on job well done,
Thank
because that
you.
was awesome. And that particular line where the idea that the worm changes you, that idea of transformation coming from the worm and being the worm's motivation, um, that connects back to the beginning of the mythology with changing the world from Pangea, right? That's,
Right.
yeah.
I mean, that's they presume that because I mean, the worm, essentially the first timeline where it was the Pangeans, had lived on and on up to what would have been modern time. They didn't do what the worm wanted, so he changed the world and it cost them, and now the humans are here. So the assumption by the cult is essentially, if we do what the worm wants, then the worm will give us the kind that will again change the world, but the way we want it to be.
Right. Which kind of thematically reminds me also of Octavia Butler's God is Change in the parable books, but in a really cool way. But I love that. I love that about the mythology of where it becomes. The other thing I like about it is it's cosmic scale, but it's relatable motivation for the people to connect to this thing, because the worm's ability to change the world is grand and cosmic, but the way that the people who interface with it is personal and human. So was that a happy accident, or something from the very beginning that you wanted
I
to
mean, that came
balance?
with the characters because I think, with the worm's lore being what it was, and the fact that his how he works, how he is going to be interpreted through people, then all of that ends up mattering, based on the characters. If there were, excuse me, if there were a bunch of scientists who were just like this, if it was all people like Corin, for example, there we would have a very different book, because
Mhm.
they wouldn't think the same things about the worm as Donna and the cult does.
Yeah. Well, and what's really okay, so now I kind of teased this with the similarities to Wet Bones, but my all-time favorite horror novel of all time is John Shirley's Wet Bones, and it's somewhat Lovecraftian, kind of cosmic horror thing to a degree, but the cosmic creature in the book feeds off addiction, right? And
Oh,
manipulates, and there's a serial killer in the book who can control this creature that feeds on your addiction, and basically can make people do awful, horrible things. So he doesn't have to do it himself. And John was fighting, was trying to get clean from heroin when he wrote it. So it's a very angry, very intense horror novel. And
Okay.
yeah, it's really cool. But what was neat for me is that the worm in this book, it's not exactly the same, but what the worm does in this book that reminded me of Wet Bones was that it the worm can play to your desire for that change, for that it can find some of your deepest, darkest hopes and desires for change and really manipulate them in a really scary way. At least that's what it felt like to me. And that's what really spoke to me on that. Was I reading something into it that wasn't
Well,
there?
here's the funny thing. So I think that the neat thing about the worm is that even the reader is going to have their um, understanding of the worm based on what the other characters are saying, because we don't know, like, if you none of the characters know what the worm is. Definitely, like, there's even a question: is there a he? Is this even a god, or is it just a gravitational anomaly?
Hmm.
Like, Corin brings that up. There's like, they're just worshiping gravity.
Right.
um and so, I mean, you can definitely look at the worm that way. I think it's the way a lot of different organizations or any kind of hierarchical structure is going to have a point where people feel like they can get what they want if they do what they're supposed to do with it. Um, but like the worm, I mean, it's all stories and not hypotheticals, but just interpretations by everybody. Like, we never really get to see what the worm does aside from either smash continents or prevent the smashing of continents. Um, like, that's and now we really get into spoilers. But like, one of the questions, it so interests me. This is like super, super big spoiler. So if people are still hanging around wondering, they should
No,
probably
no,
go.
they should
Okay.
not listen to any of this if they haven't read it
Okay.
yet.
So, it's interesting to me. Nobody's actually like asked me. So did Monique actually become the worm at the end, or did she die and the worm was changed by her?
Hmm.
Um,
And no one's asked you that, and you don't
no
really
one's
want to
asked me
answer
that,
it.
and I'm not going to tell them either.
Right, right. No, but that transformation is that's one of the parallels that that
Right. And that's why when I say queer cosmic horror, a lot of people assume, okay, it's a cosmic horror story that has queer characters in it. But it's like, no, it's not just that. Thematically and baked into the lore is this queer sense, because it is about this transitional stuff. It is about this transformational stuff.
mhm. And what she may or may not become at the end,
Right.
and this ability for this creature to possibly make you into something that you maybe desired or wanted to be but didn't understand, you
Right.
know as it comes, which is one of the totally genius um in construction, as far as those parallels, in which and when I say that I love parallels and reversals, it's like if I see a parallel like that, I geek out about it, because I'm just like, wow, it's really powerful stuff. So to me, one of the and I do want to talk about was it Dr. Sam and that whole thing a little bit, but
Yeah.
that because yeah, that's heartbreaking stuff. But I think the most powerful the most powerful part of the book, and I'm sorry to do this, but I have it in front of you, so to read your book back to you. But to me, the most powerful part of the book was and here in the darkest place, Monique found monsters. Maybe if her parents knew how far she had fallen, they would at last regret having banished their only child. Unlikely, that was her imagination preying on her thoughts, with something more painful than monsters and the illusion that her parents could accept her. Like, that was crushing when I read it. And I'm the type of reader that when I read something like that, because I know I'm going to write about a book, because that's I started doing the reviews because I wanted to absorb books more than just read them, right? Like, I don't
Yeah.
really care if anyone reads my reviews or not. Like, it's nice if they do, but it's more for me. And this was a line in the book that I read and reread and thought a lot about because it just jumped out at me on there. So, but there again, that's another way that this is queer cosmic horror, because I think and thankfully we have a lot more acceptance in 2021 than we did. And I think I might have mentioned this in my review, but I had a close friend, a roommate of mine in 1999 who transitioned and went through the gender dysmorphia stuff, and he came out of it with a lot of support. Like, his family supported him, and is now, as far as I know, had a better situation than some people. But back in the past, that we definitely had even less support. So reading this was just very heartbreaking for me. And I don't
Yeah.
know.
Unfortunately, and like it's yeah, and unfortunately, Monique was pushed out when she was 18, and we still have a lot of queer homeless,
Yes.
problems these days, with people not being able to come out of the closet and then stay in their homes or stay with their families and be cared for and cared about.
Hmm. And that's what makes this part of the story so important. I do think it's kind of a spoiler. That's why I put it in spoilers. But I
Yeah,
do think,
no, that makes sense.
yeah, but I do think, you know, uh, that storyline and somebody who gets pushed out and has to deal with it is one of those things that adds to the book, that it makes it something that people need to read, because it's a point of view that we don't see often in horror, and it's
Yeah, I've had a few times people say this is the first book they've read with a trans protagonist.
yeah. Well, and for an important part of the story is, the and I know here in San Diego we have they have a really cool support network for trans homeless in San Diego, and homelessness is a big issue here because, like, people come here because they think it's easier to live homeless where the weather's pretty awesome all the time. So it is a big issue, but I think that idea that Monique was dealing with, that her parents completely rejected her, she ended up on the street, and then her partner, her lover, chooses this transformation and this worm, and that's where at the end of the mystery is this question, like, do I accept this cosmic change? Awesome. um just really cool stuff. But yeah, I don't really have a question. I just love to I just wanted to tell you how great that was, and hear
Thank
your
you.
thoughts on I mean, was that, she had to have been homeless from the beginning of the idea. That had to be baked in right from the
Right.
beginning,
Yeah.
right?
Once Monique was no, that was one of the early parts of Monique, was that because it was already starting to blossom from her that this was thematic, that this was significant, because when a cult or an organization that's looking for people, a lot of times they will try to find people who are desperate, and that this was going to connect with her in some way. I didn't have all those answers right when I started, of course, but they're the kinds of things you do figure out as as the characters are revealing themselves to you, and you're figuring out more about them and more how they connect with the themes and lore and other characters.
Hmm. Now, I well, I sorry to talk about my own work here a little bit, but I wrote a book that hasn't found a home yet last year, that has a trans character, and I made the choice to not point it out, pretty much. Right?
Yeah.
I just there's little things, and there's clues that, if but I just wanted it to be I just wanted her to be a character in the book, right? And just
Yeah.
and one of my trusted readers who read it, I was glad at one point they said, "Hey, is this character trans?" And I was like, "Yes." And then they were like, "Okay, just checking." But for me, like it was a line. It, being that I'm cisgender, I wanted to be very careful on it. Now, for you writing about these issues, it's very different, and I think heading into the issues with Dr. Sam and those kinds of things, I think was definitely moments that I had never seen in a horror novel, and felt like just as heartbreaking as those moments with that were. I just felt really happy to, in a sad way, to see that highlighted in a horror novel was, I think, important. But
Yeah, I agree.
yeah.
I
So
think a lot of people don't realize a lot of the stuff that goes on around them if it's not, related to their experience. And I do think it's important to get into that. This is stuff that happens, trans people who are desperate because our healthcare system is garbage.
right.
Um, go go to back alley doctors like Dr. Sam and try to do the best they can. They don't all meet somebody who's like Dr. Sam, where he's like, connected to the black market with organ stuff, but still, I mean, it's also a horror book, so and then I'm sure there are people like that too. But,
Hmm.
yeah, it's just it was important to me to reflect these things um, and also kind of dig into some of my own, you know, fears and concerns and things.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, it was all very powerfully done, and it just adds to the things that make the book important. At the same time, now when I was writing about it as cisgender, person, I was also wanting to be very careful to let the book um, do those things, and not. And there were certain things that I thought I shouldn't be writing about, because for one thing, they're huge spoilers, and for one thing, and then two, for um, I can't do it justice, and I think that that's the way with a lot of books, but yeah, it was a really powerful part of the story. So the last thing I have on this the spoilers, and then you've given me an awful lot of your day, and I really appreciate that.
I'm
Uh,
happy to be here.
yeah, but I think, does the worm mythology grow from here, or is this a one off? Are we going to see this world again? And were you thinking of that while you were writing it?
When I wrote it, it was just a one-off. I felt like I told everything. Right now I'm thinking about some things. I'm not sure if anything will come of it. We'll see what happens though.
Hmm. So, and now, because I did this in spoilers, because I think it could be like a spoilery thing, but the last thing I really got is, what's the most, like, kind of weird and hilarious, not hilarious, hilarious or not hilarious ways that people have interpreted this book? Because I think that's one of the funny things that happens when you put something out like this in the world. Um, it's happened to me before, where people like see a totally different story out of something, and I'm just like, okay, I wasn't going for that, but okay. Like
Yeah,
what?
there've been a couple. It's funny. I wouldn't say funny on its own, but it is interesting how differently some people interpret the ending because um, most people understand what happens in it, but they don't have the same reaction to it. Some people are kind of like stunned. Other people, like, they're very upset, which is interesting to me because other people are like, well, that was a very peaceful ending to the book. Which is like, all of those are interesting to me because it's not an ending that I think you can have like kind of a whatever reaction to.
Right, right.
Um, I'm not sure. though, like some people have said this is a lot of fun, and I'm just like, it was. um, but I
Well,
mean that's up to them.
I thought it was fun in the sense that even when I'm being like heartbroken by scenes and like when it's like, freaking me out, like that's I'm having fun because I'm like I'm in the hands of a awesome storyteller
And
and
that makes sense. I'm always confused about how to interpret that because like I'm like, but weren't you miserable a little bit?
yeah, yeah. Oh no, there is the balance on that because there are
Yeah.
definitely miserable moments where well for me too when an author can make me feel miserable, I'm so impressed.
It's not like I want that necessarily. I just want people to feel something. I want to
Bingo. Yeah.
connect. I want to connect and have a genuine emotional reaction and, contemplation and such. Like that's my main goal with stuff. Like Benny Rose has gotten such interesting things because some people like, this was the best gore I've ever read. And I'm just like, I'm glad you enjoyed the book, but I mean, I was hoping there was a little more to it than that.
Right. Right.
But
Yeah.
yeah.
I no, I can see that. Now, for me, a lot of times, like when I read a moment that's really heartbreaking, like that last part that I read, like there can be a moment where I'm reading a book where, because I a lot of times I read at night, I put on music and I read, and then I just sit there, and if I out loud just go oof oof, like at a part in a book, you know, I was just reading this last month. I also read Brian Evanson's new collection, The Classy Burning Floor of Hell. And there's like maybe 18 wolf moments in that book where I'm just like, woof. And I, I had that a lot in this book. And that's when I know, like, okay, that I'm feeling something. I'm feeling like, you know, and I think that's horror fiction at its best. I don't know, and I also feel like it's incumbent on the readers. You're never going to find something scary if you don't put yourself in the shoes of the characters, and so that's our job is to make characters that are undeniable,
Yeah.
that kind of come off like that, and that's more so Monique for me than anybody else in this book. But Monique was very relatable character, and for that reason, the book just really worked for me. And so that is funny and interesting that yeah, I could see that this book would have different interpretations that would be fun for an author to sit back and be like, okay, you
Yeah,
said
I'll
that.
be honest, I don't look at a lot of that stuff, because I mean, I think at a certain point as an author, you get the temperature of the room on a book
Mhm.
and, you kind of aren't looking as much. So a lot of the recent reactions are more people like for you example, coming to me and telling me how they felt about it as opposed to me like kind of keeping an eye out for that stuff,
Right, right.
which I
Well,
appreciate.
well, no, and that's one of the fun things for me about doing the podcast is because it gives me a chance to talk to writers and learn from everybody um, about what makes their books tick. And this one was so good. So I hope to talk to you again in the future about other work.
That'd be lovely.
Yeah, God, this was great. And so the Worm and His Kings. And was this always intended for a standalone book, or did it just kind of grow out of
I
something
mean,
else?
there was a time where it was gonna be a novel, and that wasn't working, and there was a time I tried to do a short story, and that wasn't working, and this ended up being the right,
That was perfect.
right compromise between those lengths.
Yeah, but if Of Mice and Men is considered a novel, it's 107 pages. So
It's hard. It's isn't that difficult? It's so complicated with and then you get into, like, if you have a book that's, like, gigantic and, like, all the letters are huge, then, like, it can be more pages, and it's so complicated. That's why I think each book should just be as long as it needs to be, like, just tell the story, don't pad it out or cut away what's important, just tell the story, and that's what people really appreciate, I think.
absolutely. All right, Hailey, it was amazing having you on Postcards from a Dying World, and I definitely think that you are a writer wise beyond her years, and I can tell we've got a lot of great stuff coming. And I
Thank
am
you.
just so stoked to read this. And it's funny because it's one of those cases where there was a lot of hype, and I was like a little nervous that it wouldn't live up to the hype, and it actually exceeded what I was expecting. So that was great.
It's been an interesting experience with this book particularly.
Do you feel that this is a turning point for you where you came into your own? Because I don't.
Um, i- yeah, I mean, I think there was definitely a point where I was like realizing I definitely this was a turning point. I feel like with my earlier books I was coming into my own, but this one was definitely a career turning point.
Mm,
Um, but also, yeah, as a storyteller, because it kind of helped me get a better idea of what I want to do. Like I think the Possession that Glasgow has kind of the least of that in a way because I was testing waters. I was seeing if like this idea was going to work. Benny Rose is more of like very like feminist kind of story
mhm.
for me, and this one was more just like kind of sinking into things and just letting things be what I wanted them to be. And that's really what I've been writing since I wrote it, and what I want to continue writing is just doing what I want to do.
All right, and next is Queen of Teeth, right?
Yeah, and that's probably even more so than this one. Is just I just stopped. I tell people when they ask about it, I'm just like, I just stopped saying no to myself at every turn of that book. I just didn't say no to myself, and it still went through many revisions and changes to help sharpen into the best story it could be. But I really just was just like, is this too weird? And it's like, no, it's not too weird. Just do it. Just keep going. Just do things. That's how we get unique fiction.
That's exactly right, and that's a great way to end. All right, Haley, thank you for joining us. I
Thank
know
you for
I've
having
said
me.
I've said goodbye twice because I
It's
thought about
okay. It's fine.
it. All
But
right, yeah, folks, check it out. And where can people find you online?
I'm at www.haileypiper.com. And on Twitter, I'm at Hailey Piper Says. And on Instagram, I'm at Hailey Piper Fights.
Awesome, great work, and hopefully we'll talk to you again.
Hopefully. Thank you again for having me.